wind off the Chicago River cut through the skeletal frame of the tower like a ghost. I stood on the 27th floor surrounded by unfinished concrete and silence. Below me the city stretched out, a mosaic of light and noise, but up here it felt like another world entirely. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon, so you never miss a story like this one. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had drawn the first lines of this building years ago. They were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from something heavier. Disbelief. The company truck that had brought me here was gone. So was my son. The wind carried only the faint metallic clang of a loose cable tapping against a steel beam. A hollow rhythm that matched the ache inside my chest. He'd taken my car keys, my briefcase, my phone. And just like that, after 40 years of work, 40 years of building things meant to last, he had left me standing on the skeleton of my own failure. The city moved on without me. From up here you could see it, people hurrying through the streets, headlights gliding over wet asphalt, cranes pivoting like patient beasts. Progress never stopped, even when your own world did. I had taught him that once, that the work must go on. I never imagined he'd use that same lesson to erase me. The chill bit at my fingers, but I didn't move. My breath came in clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed, just like all the promises he'd made. I thought of the last thing he said before the elevator doors closed. "You wouldn't understand, Dad. This is how business works now." Business. That word used to mean integrity to me. Men shaking hands over rebar and blueprints, deals sealed with effort and trust. Now it was just a word that meant leverage. I glanced at the skyline, at the old landmarks I had helped raise. The buildings had my fingerprints somewhere deep in their concrete bones. I had poured my life into this city, one column, one beam, one foundation at a time, and now my own blood had reduced it all to numbers in a ledger. I started walking toward the temporary stairwell, the kind made of bolted steel and plywood. My boots echoed with each step, heavy and hollow. I didn't have a phone to call for a ride, didn't have a wallet to pay for one. I only had the keys to the site trailer, the one he must have forgotten to take. Down at ground level, the site was empty. Just wind, dust, and the faint hum of generators still running in the distance. The tower's shadow stretched long over the river, splitting the water in two. Light on one side, darkness on the other. I walked to the trailer, the door creaking open on old hinges. Inside, the smell of coffee and sawdust hit me like an old memory. My thermos was still there, dented from years on job sites. I poured what little was left into the cap and drank it cold. Bitter. Familiar. Real. For a long time, I just stood there staring at the blueprint tacked to the wall. My blueprint. The lines were precise, perfect even. They told a story of balance and endurance, every angle accounted for, every stress point resolved. But as I looked closer, I saw something I'd never noticed before. A faint smudge, a pencil mark running across the margin. My son's mark. He'd redrawn one of the load-bearing walls to make room for an executive suite. He didn't care about the structure, he cared about the view. That's when I realized it wasn't just money he'd stolen, it was purpose. He had gutted the company's integrity and left its frame standing, just like this tower. I stepped outside again. The clouds had thickened over the city, turning the skyline into a series of gray ghosts. I thought about calling the police, reporting the theft, but the idea made me tired. I didn't want him in jail. I wanted him to understand what he had done, not just to me, but to himself. So I did what I always did when a project went wrong. I took out my old notebook, the one I kept in my coat pocket, and started a new page. At the top, I wrote 2 words: damage report, Underneath, I began listing everything that was gone. Company shares gone, pension account frozen, trust fund emptied, respect missing, faith shattered. Then, under all of that, I wrote one final word. Foundation. And next to it I drew a small circle. Not gone. Not yet. It was getting dark now. The cranes stood still against the fading light like watchmen keeping silent over the ruins of ambition. Somewhere in the distance a freight train wailed, that long, lonely sound that always made me think of endings. I picked up my hard hat from the dirt and brushed it off. On the front, my old company's logo, Sterling and Son Construction, was faded and cracked. That and Son had once been my proudest addition. Now it felt like graffiti on a tombstone. I took a slow breath and let the air fill my lungs. Cold, sharp, alive. There was no going back to what we were, no patching the cracks that had split clean through the foundation of our family. But maybe, just maybe, there was still something left to build. Not out of profit, not out of pride, but out of principle. The city lights flickered on one by one, windows becoming constellations in the steel sky. I turned toward them, the sound of the wind like whispers of ghosts I once knew. "All right," I said to no one in particular. "Let's start from the ground up." The words didn't echo. They landed softly, like blueprints being laid out on an empty table. I started walking toward the street. My reflection shimmered briefly in a puddle of rainwater. Tired eyes, gray beard, a man stripped down to truth. The sound of my boots on the wet pavement was steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. I wasn't walking away from something anymore. I was walking toward what came next. By the time I got home that night, the rain had turned into a thin mist that clung to everything. The kind of weather that makes the whole city feel like it's holding its breath. I parked on the curb, looked up at the house, and felt something shift inside me. A strange mixture of grief and relief. The porch light was still on, a small circle of gold cutting through the dark, but it felt more like a spotlight on what was left of me. The key turned easily in the lock, but as the door swung open, the silence that waited inside wasn't welcoming. It was the kind of silence that used to belong to construction sites after the last worker clocked out, hollow, unfinished, and honest. The house smelled faintly of sawdust and lemon oil, just like it did when my wife was alive. I stood there in the doorway for a long time, not ready to step inside, because I knew once I did, the weight of what had happened would land for good. Finally, I took a slow breath and crossed the threshold. My boots left faint wet marks on the hardwood, a small trail leading from the man I used to be to the man I had no choice but to become. On the wall by the staircase hung a framed photo. Me, my wife, and our son at the opening of our first major project. I was wearing a hard hat. She was smiling like sunlight, and he was barely out of college, full of plans. His hand was on my shoulder then. I couldn't remember the last time it had been there since. I went straight to my office. It still smelled like pencil shavings and paper. The scent of thinking men who drew their own futures. My drafting table was exactly how I'd left it. Rulers, old blueprints, and an ashtray I hadn't used in years. I sat down, pulled a clean sheet from the drawer, and laid it flat in front of me. The blankness of it felt almost mocking. For most of my life I had built things from lines and measurements, tangible shapes I could hold, touch, and understand. But there was no blueprint for what had just happened. I tried to find anger, but what I felt instead was hollowness, a kind of echo that came from somewhere deeper than rage. When you build your life around someone, you don't expect them to take the foundation with them when they leave. The rain tapped against the windows in uneven rhythms. It sounded like nails falling into a bucket. I leaned back in my chair and let the sound fill the room. My wife used to love nights like this. She'd light a candle, make tea, and talk about how the city's heartbeat slowed down when it rained. Now it was just me and the noise of something unfinished. On the bookshelf across from me were the binders that held the company's history. Project bids, inspection records, permits. I pulled one out and flipped through it. Each page was another memory, another story. The office tower on Wacker Drive, the bridges along the Calumet, even the small public library we built on the south side. I had been proud of those things once, but pride doesn't fill the cracks left by betrayal. Somewhere in those binders was the paperwork that handed my son the keys to everything. Power of attorney, corporate authorization. It was my handwriting on the dotted lines, my trust, signed in ink. I used to think I was teaching him how to build. Turns out I was teaching him where the weak spots were. I set the binder down and rubbed my temples. Every time I thought about him driving away, the memory hit differently. The first time it burned, the second time it just stung. But by the third I realized something. It wasn't shock anymore, it was understanding. He hadn't just left me behind, he'd revealed who he was. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, marking the empty hours. I got up, poured myself a glass of water, and looked out the window. Across the street, the neighbor's house glowed with warmth, laughter spilling through the curtains, silhouettes moving across the light. That used to be us. Before money, before ego, before ambition turned love into leverage. I pressed my hand against the cold glass. For years, I'd told myself I was building a legacy for my son. But legacies built on entitlement don't last. They crack under their own weight. I turned back to the drafting table. The blank sheet of paper waited, patient. I reached for a pencil and drew one straight line across it, then another. Slowly, the beginnings of a new design took shape. Not of a building, but of a plan. It wouldn't be built out of steel or glass this time. It would be made of silence, precision, and patience, the three materials my son had never learned to use. I stayed there for hours, sketching not what I had lost, but what I would rebuild. Not the company that was gone, but myself. When I finally looked up, dawn was pushing against the edges of the night. The light came through the blinds like scaffolding, lines of promise laid across the floor. I walked to the mantel and picked up another photograph, this one of my wife standing at the edge of Lake Michigan, wind in her hair. She had been gone 10 years, but her voice was still as clear as the waves behind her. "Patrick," she used to say, "you can't control what people build on your foundation, but you can choose when to stop holding it up." I whispered it back to the empty room. "I'm done holding it up." Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened the curtains, let the morning light in, and watched the rain turn to gold. The city was waking up again, and so was I. The first phase of any rebuild is demolition. But the trick, I remembered, is not to destroy more than you have to. I walked back to my desk, opened my ledger, and wrote a single note at the top of a new page. Step 1. Assess the damage. The following morning, I found myself sitting in a diner that hadn't changed since the first time I walked in 40 years ago. The same worn vinyl booths, the same faded photographs of the skyline when Sears Tower still ruled it. Even the same waitress, though she moved a little slower now, poured my coffee with the same absent-minded care. Chicago has a way of staying old and new at the same time, like a structure that keeps renovating its skin but never its bones. I wrapped my hands around the mug, feeling the heat work its way into my fingers. I'd been awake most of the night, drawing lines on paper that meant nothing yet. When the sun rose, I realized what I needed wasn't another blueprint. It was a conversation. There were only 2 men left in this city who still called me by my first name instead of Sir or Mr. Sterling. One of them was buried next to my wife. The other was Thomas "Tom" Hanley. My partner, my oldest friend, and the man who'd once stood beside me when we broke ground on our first high-rise. Tom had retired years ago after his wife's illness. He'd moved to a smaller place in Oak Park, where the streets were quiet and the trees lined up like columns on an old Greek plan. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year, but as I sat there with the taste of burnt coffee and old grief, I knew there was no one else who could understand what had been lost. I called him from the payphone by the door, the same one that had survived 3 remodels and at least 1 attempted theft. "Patrick?" His voice sounded older, rougher, like gravel under a truck tire. "Yeah, it's me." A pause. "You sound like a man standing in the middle of a demolition site." I let out a quiet laugh. "Close enough." By noon, I was sitting across from him at his kitchen table. The place smelled like sawdust and toast, exactly how I remembered it. Blueprints still covered the walls, yellowed and curling at the edges. Old habits die hard for men like us. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. "You've got the look of a man who's seen the cracks finally show." I nodded. "My son sold off half the company's assets, left me stranded on site yesterday." Tom didn't flinch. He just leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. "I always thought he had too much speed and not enough weight." That was Tom's way of saying he moved too fast, thought too little. I stared at the floor. "He said I wouldn't understand business now. That the world's different, digital, leveraged, whatever word they use to make betrayal sound efficient." Tom snorted. "Steel's still steel, Patrick. You can wrap it in software and call it innovation, but if the foundation's cracked, the whole damn thing will fall." I felt something tighten in my throat. Not sadness exactly, but recognition. Tom had always spoken in structures just like me. It wasn't about buildings, it was about people, about truth. I told him everything. The signatures, the trust, the forged transfers, the lies. When I was done, the coffee in our cups had gone cold. He tapped the table gently with his index finger, like a man testing a beam. "You built something meant to outlive you." He treated it like scaffolding, temporary, disposable. "But you know what that means." "What?" He leaned forward, his voice steady. "It means you still own the foundation. And a foundation can always be rebuilt." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of traffic outside. Finally, I said, "I don't even know where to start." Tom smiled, that half smile that used to drive our clients crazy because it meant he was already 10 steps ahead. "You start the same place we always did, with the survey. You figure out what's still standing. You find out who's holding what. Then you draw a new plan. Quietly." I frowned. "Quietly?" He nodded. "Patrick, the moment you start shouting about injustice, they brand you as emotional, irrational, or senile. But when you move in silence, when you plan, they don't hear the sound of the hammer until the wall's already down." That was when the first real glimmer of resolve took hold. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the small notepad I'd been writing in since yesterday, the one that had damage report written across the first page. I flipped to a clean sheet and wrote down 3 new words. "Structural survey begins." Tom leaned over and read it. His eyes softened. "You've still got the hand for it," he said. Then he reached for his old address book and flipped through the pages. "There's a man named Alan Bishop. Used to be an accountant for our firm, smart, discreet. He'll know where the paper trail leads." I nodded, taking down the number. Before I left, Tom walked me to the door. The light outside had shifted. The late afternoon sun slanted across his front steps, turning the dust in the air into gold. "Patrick," he said quietly, "when a structure fails, it's never just one thing. It's a series of small fractures you don't see until the collapse. But the thing about builders like us, we know how to read the cracks. I looked at him and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Calm purpose. Then I guess it's time to start reading. As I drove back toward the city, the skyline rose again in front of me. Gray, familiar, unbroken. But I didn't look at the towers. I looked at their bases, the places where the weight meets the ground. Every great structure begins and ends there. And somewhere in those shadows, my plan was already taking shape. When I pulled into my driveway that evening, the mist had returned. The porch light flickered against the damp. I stepped inside, hung my coat, and sat down at my drafting table again. I pulled out the phone book and dialed the first of several numbers. The first call was to a locksmith. The second was to Alan Bishop. And the third, though I didn't make it yet, would be to my lawyer. The lines were drawn. The measurements were clear. It was time to rebuild, not what I'd lost, but what I'd forgotten to protect. Alan Bishop's office was nothing like the slick glass boxes my son preferred. It was small, tucked into the second floor of an old brick building on the west side of Chicago, the kind of place that still smelled faintly of ink, carbon paper, and trust. The sign on the door read Bishop Financial Consulting, in peeling gold letters that had once been proud. I hadn't seen Alan in years, but when he opened the door, he smiled in recognition. "Patrick," he said, his voice the same even tone I remembered from every audit meeting. "You look weathered." "I've been through a few storms," I said. He nodded. "Then you came to the right place." Inside, the room was lined with filing cabinets and ledgers stacked like miniature skyscrapers. Alan gestured for me to sit at the desk opposite him. "Coffee?" "Please." He poured 2 cups from an old percolator and handed me one. The first sip tasted like burnt paper, but it was real. No digital polish, no expensive roast, just the kind of coffee that wakes you up enough to face what's coming. "So," he said, folding his hands, "Tom called ahead, said you need a paper trail dug up." "Not just a trail," I replied. "I need the whole map." Alan leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're talking about your son, aren't you?" I didn't answer right away. Silence in moments like this carries more truth than words. He took that as confirmation. "All right," he said softly. "Let's start with what you know." I laid it all out. The transfers, the power of attorney, the missing accounts, the half-built skyscraper left under my name. Alan didn't interrupt, not once. He just listened, taking notes in neat, precise handwriting. Every few minutes he'd tap his pen against the paper like a metronome, marking the rhythm of the unraveling. When I was done, he turned the page in his notebook. "I'll be honest," he said, "it's bad but not unrecoverable. He's been moving money, not property. That's easier to trace if you know where to look." He stood and opened one of the filing cabinets. "Do you remember the old vendor accounts you set up when you and Tom ran the firm?" I nodded. "Those are still under your name. Some of them are dormant, but they're tied to the parent trust. If your son rerouted payments or liquidated shares, there will be echoes. Transaction reports, vendor emails, signature logs. The paper may be digital now, but it still leaves fingerprints." He pulled out a folder and flipped it open. The pages were dense with numbers and dates, but one stood out, a transfer of $480,000 marked under a new consulting firm I didn't recognize. "Metro Growth Advisors," Alan read aloud. "Ring a bell?" "No," I said, "but I can guess whose idea it was." He nodded grimly. "I'll dig deeper. I've seen this before. Shell companies used to funnel money out of corporate accounts, clean on paper, dirty underneath." I felt the old heat rise in my chest, that deep, slow burn that starts behind the ribs and works its way upward. But I didn't let it spill over. Not yet. Alan slid the folder toward me. Take this home. Go through every name, every date. If you see a signature you don't remember, mark it. I'll cross-reference the account numbers. He paused, then looked me straight in the eye. Patrick, I know this hurts. But don't let it turn into anger. Anger builds nothing. What you're doing now, this is construction. Careful, measured, deliberate. Don't forget that. I nodded. I won't. As I stood to leave, he said one more thing. And Patrick, don't call him yet. Not until you've got your whole structure reinforced. Once you confront him, the game changes. I stopped at the door. Alan, I said quietly, it's not a game anymore. I know, he replied. That's why you're going to win. The air outside was colder now. I walked along the street, folder under my arm, the wind pushing against me like resistance I had to earn. The city felt different. The noises sharper, the spaces wider. Every sound echoed off the buildings. The groan of the train tracks, the hiss of bus brakes, the distant hum of 1,000 lives moving forward. By the time I got home, dusk had settled in, painting everything in bruised shades of gray and violet. I set the folder on my drafting table and turned on the lamp. The yellow light spilled across the papers, turning the ink into shadows. I traced each number with my finger, every transaction like a crack in a wall. My son had built a whole false structure out of deceit, and I was staring at the blueprints of his betrayal. But he'd forgotten one thing. I was the one who taught him how to build, and that meant I also knew how to dismantle. Halfway through the file, I found a digital authorization form with my own signature. Only it wasn't mine. The handwriting was perfect, but the spacing was wrong. My hand always leaned slightly to the right. This one slanted left. A small difference, but to a builder's eye, small differences are the first signs of collapse. I sat back and stared at the page. It was strange. The anger didn't flare. Instead, there was a quiet certainty, like a blueprint unfolding in my mind. The plan was starting to write itself. I took out my notebook again and wrote 3 short notes. Confirm forgery through legal witness, secure new counsel, reclaim the foundation. I underlined the third one twice. Outside, thunder rumbled low over the lake, deep and patient. I closed the file, leaned back, and let the sound roll through the house. It felt less like a storm and more like an announcement, a warning that something strong was moving through. I reached for my pen and drew a single line down the center of the notepad. On one side I wrote, what he took, on the other, what I still have. By the time I finished listing everything, the right column was longer. He'd taken the company, the accounts, the trust. But I still had my knowledge, my discipline, my integrity, and the truth. And truth, once unearthed, is the one structure no thief can rebuild in his image. I closed the notebook, shut off the lamp, and let the house fall into darkness. The rain had stopped, leaving the streetlights mirrored in the wet pavement outside. For the first time since that day on the construction site, I didn't feel broken. I felt anchored. Because I had seen the cracks. And now, I knew exactly where to place the supports. There's a sound every builder knows, the hollow echo that follows when the first support beam comes loose. It's the moment between stability and collapse. Quiet, almost tender, but final. That was the sound I heard in my mind the morning I decided to move forward. Chicago was waking under a slow gray sky when I left the house. The streets glistened with yesterday's rain, and every puddle reflected pieces of the skyline I had helped raise. They looked inverted, upside-down towers floating in shallow water, a fitting mirror for the life I'd been living. I stopped at a small hardware store on the way, bought a new padlock for my front gate and a steel key box for the side door. The man behind the counter didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Men of a certain age buying locks early in the morning rarely need to explain themselves. By the time I reached Alan's office, he already had 3 new folders laid out on the table. Each was labeled neatly in his careful handwriting. Forgery evidence, asset movements, legal contacts. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Looks like you've been busy." He nodded. "Found what we needed." He opened the first folder and pushed a page toward me. It was the authorization form I'd seen last night. The one with my forged signature. "I compared this against your bank records and earlier trust documents," Alan said. "The handwriting was digitally replicated using an old scan of your signature from an account verification. Whoever did it knew exactly where to look." "My son," I said quietly. "He would have had access." Alan didn't contradict me. The forgery alone is enough to revoke his authority under power of attorney. But I'd suggest we prepare the next step before we file. "What's the next step?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "The demolition?" He laid out the plan like an architect unfurling a blueprint. 3 stages, precise and deliberate. Stage 1. Freeze the accounts connected to the forged authorizations. Legally, it would look routine. A standard internal review prompted by irregular activity. No alarms, no confrontation. Just a quiet lockdown. Stage 2. Reclaim the property. Titles that were still under my personal ownership, including the old firm's main office downtown. Alan had already confirmed that the deed was still in my name. "He can't touch it without your physical signature," he said. "That's your cornerstone." Stage 3. Establish a new holding trust in my wife's name, separate from every previous structure. "Once that's in place," Alan explained, "you move your primary assets there. It'll be sealed, permanent. Not even your son's lawyer can pry it open." I listened, every detail sinking in like the sound of measured hammer blows. It was a builder's plan, not built to punish but to preserve. Alan paused. "You'll need a lawyer you can trust completely, someone sharp, quiet, and old school." I took the liberty of calling Ben O'Hara. The name stirred something familiar. Ben had handled zoning appeals for us 2 decades ago, a man who could make bureaucrats tremble with a raised eyebrow. "He's still practicing?" I asked. Alan nodded. "Still hates dishonesty." When I left the office, the folder under my arm felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't paperweight. It was the gravity of knowing I'd just started something I couldn't reverse. I met Ben that afternoon in his office near the river. The walls were lined with photographs of buildings he'd helped defend from demolition. Old warehouses, historic homes, the kind of places that carried stories in their bricks. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe time had just shrunk the world around me. "Patrick," he said, shaking my hand, "it's been too long." "It's been long enough," I said. He motioned for me to sit. "Alan filled me in on the basics. I need the rest, everything you've got." So I told him about the highway, the missing accounts, the forgery, about my son driving off without a backward glance. Ben listened like a man used to bad news. When I finished, he leaned back, tapping a pen against his desk. "You're right not to confront him yet," he said. "You can't reason with someone who believes ownership excuses cruelty. You have to let the law speak first. And when it does, it needs to be absolute." He slid a document toward me. A preliminary draft of a revocation of power of attorney. "Once you sign this," he said, "he's legally severed. No warning, no loopholes. But I suggest you wait 48 hours before filing. It'll give me time to notify the banks quietly." I studied the paper. My name at the top looked foreign, like someone I used to know. 48 hours, I repeated, then we close the gate. Ben nodded. Once the locks change, they never open the same way again. That night back home, I sat in my study with the new lock and keys in front of me. The rain had returned, drumming softly on the windows. I picked up the screwdriver and removed the old brass latch from the front door. The metal groaned as if protesting the change. Each screw that came loose felt like undoing a memory. Birthdays, homecomings. The times my son had walked through this door without knocking. I replaced it with the new deadbolt, heavier and colder. When I turned the key for the first time, it clicked deep and clean. That sound, that small metallic certainty, was more final than any argument could ever be. In the kitchen, I made myself a cup of tea. My wife had always said that rebuilding starts with small rituals. If your hands are steady enough to make tea, she'd tell me, then your heart is steady enough to keep going. I took the mug to the living room and sat in my old armchair. The house was quiet except for the steady rhythm of rain. The folders were stacked neatly on the coffee table. The pen rested beside them like a chisel waiting for the first strike. I thought of my son. His confident stride, his expensive suit, the way he used to call me old man half-jokingly, as if age were a flaw I could fix. Somewhere out there he was living under the illusion of control, unaware that the foundation beneath him was already shifting. I didn't wish him harm. I only wished him truth, the kind that arrives not with thunder but with silence. I picked up the pen and opened my notebook. On a fresh page I wrote, Phase 1. Remove the rotten beams. Phase 2. Reinforce the foundation. Phase 3. Rebuild. In her name. Then I closed the book and let the words settle. The plan was clear. The path forward was narrow but solid. Outside, the rain eased into a gentle mist. The city lights blurred against the wet glass, glowing like embers beneath smoke. I sat there, the new key warm in my hand, and realized something that felt almost like peace. Demolition isn't destruction. It's preparation. It's the only way to make room for what deserves to last. The day I signed the revocation papers, the air outside carried the smell of wet stone and diesel. The scent of a city rebuilding itself, one truckload at a time. I walked into Ben O'Hara's office just after sunrise, a folder tucked under my arm and the kind of calm that comes when there's no turning back. Ben was already standing by the window, tie loosened, glasses halfway down his nose. Alan was there too, sleeves rolled up, a black coffee cooling beside a pile of documents. The blinds were half drawn, the light slanting through like scaffolding shadows. "You ready?" Ben asked. "I've been ready since the day he left me on that site," I said. He handed me the pen. A heavy silver thing with a worn grip, the kind of instrument used for decisions that don't get undone. "Once you sign this," he said, "you're cutting every legal tie. From that moment, your son has no access to your assets, your accounts, or any part of the company you built. The banks will be notified immediately, the filings delivered by courier within the hour." I looked at the papers. My name printed in bold at the top. Below it, a list of accounts and properties, things that used to represent a life's work. "Go ahead," Ben said quietly. "Reclaim what's yours." I signed. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was almost delicate, the faint whisper of steel on parchment, the sound of a door being locked. When it was done, I set the pen down carefully. Alan gathered the papers into a neat stack. "It's official," he said. "As of this moment, he's locked out of everything. He'll find out the way people like him always do, when a card declines and the phone calls start bouncing." I didn't smile. I wasn't here for satisfaction. I was here for structure. Ben placed another file on the desk. Its cover was blue, embossed with a title in simple serif font, the Eleanor Sterling Memorial Trust. My wife's name. "This is the new foundation," he said. "Everything that matters, your properties, the remainder of your portfolio, even your life insurance, goes here. Once filed, it's permanent, irrevocable. I nodded, my voice lower than I intended. Eleanor always said a building should have a purpose beyond its shape. Ben smiled faintly. Now it does. He walked me through the clauses, the beneficiaries, the trustee structure, the inheritance conditions. It was airtight. Every line protected not wealth, but meaning. At the bottom, he pointed to one final paragraph. This, he said, is the exclusion clause. It named my son directly. Declared that he was to receive no financial benefit from the trust now or in the future. My hands didn't shake. I signed again. Another quiet scrape of ink, another foundation laid. When I was done, Ben stamped it, sealed it, and handed me the key to the safety deposit box where the originals would be kept. There, he said. That's the sound of permanence. Alan closed his notebook. That's the blueprint finished, Patrick. Everything after this is just construction. I looked at both of them. Men who'd seen too many deals built on greed and too many promises crumble under ambition. You've both done more than I can ever repay. Ben shook his head. You already did. You built this city. We're just helping you take back your piece of it. By noon, I was home again. The house felt different, not emptier but cleaner, as if the air itself had been scrubbed of something heavy. I set the new documents on the table and made myself a sandwich I barely tasted. As I ate, I thought about my son, about where he might be. A boardroom, a restaurant, maybe standing over some young executive, lecturing him on risk and innovation. He'd feel untouchable for now, he always did. But soon the cracks would show. The account alerts, the denied transfers, the quiet embarrassment of being told, "I'm sorry, sir, your card's been declined." It wouldn't be revenge exactly, more. Like equilibrium, gravity reminding him which way was down. After lunch, I went to the old company office downtown. The building had been mine for 30 years, but I hadn't walked through its lobby since I'd stepped down. The marble floor still carried the faint imprint of our logo. The receptionist, a woman who looked no older than my son had been when I founded the firm, greeted me politely, not recognizing me. "I'm here to access the executive archives," I said. She hesitated for a second, checked something on her screen, then nodded. "Of course, Mr. Sterling, right this way." The elevator ride up was silent except for the hum of the cables. When the doors opened, the smell of concrete dust and printer ink hit me like a memory. The walls were lined with old photos. Completed projects, ribbon cuttings, a young me shaking hands with men I hadn't seen in decades. I found the archive room easily. The same heavy door, the same mechanical key. Inside, the air was cool and dry. Rows of blueprints, contracts, and rolled drawings filled the shelves like bones of an extinct era. I ran my hand along one of the plans, the foundations for the Harrison Bridge. My first project. My signature still faint in the corner. Beneath the dust, the ink was strong, unbroken. I smiled at that. That's when I saw the framed photograph on the far wall. My wife and me standing on that same bridge the day it opened. The wind was pushing her hair back, and she was laughing at something I'd said. Her eyes were squinting against the sun, full of joy and certainty. She believed in permanence. In building things that could outlast people. I realized then that everything I'd done since her passing had been an attempt to preserve what she left behind. Not her possessions, but her principles. I turned back to the shelf, pulled one of the old blueprints free and spread it across the table. The lines were precise, deliberate. It struck me that what I was doing now wasn't so different from this. Finding the weak points, reinforcing what mattered, removing what couldn't be saved. The only difference was that this structure wasn't made of steel and concrete. It was made of truth. That night I sat in the living room with the city lights spilling in through the window. The documents were locked away, the signatures sealed. Everything that could be done had been done. On the coffee table, the blueprint from the office lay open beneath the lamplight. A design from decades ago drawn by a younger version of me who believed in durability. I traced one of the foundation lines with my finger, slow and steady. I realized something as I did. Revenge isn't the act of tearing something down. It's the discipline to rebuild it better, without the rot, without the weakness. My son would learn that lesson soon. Not because I'd teach it with anger, but because I'd teach it with absence. When the world stopped answering his calls, when the doors he took for granted refused to open, he'd hear the silence I'd left for him. And in that silence, he'd find truth. I turned off the lamp, left the blueprint where it was, and walked upstairs. The house creaked softly beneath my feet, the way old houses do when they're settling in for the night. I paused at the top of the stairs and looked back down into the dark. Everything that mattered was still here. Everything that didn't was gone. The demolition was complete. Tomorrow the rebuilding would begin. It started quietly, the way erosion always does, not with an explosion or a collapse, but with whispers. A denied transaction here, an unanswered email there, the kind of silence that gnaws at confidence one grain at a time. I wasn't looking for proof that it had begun. I could feel it. A subtle shift in the city's hum, as if the air around me knew that something brittle had finally cracked. By the end of that first week, the phone calls started. The first was from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again. And again. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end carried that same sharpness I used to mistake for confidence. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" My son's voice, impatient, panicked beneath the surface. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence do the talking. "Are you there?" he demanded. "The accounts, they're frozen. My corporate cards aren't working. The bank says there's a security hold. Did you?" "I did," I said, calm as a level beam. It was time to reinforce the foundation. "What does that even mean?" he snapped. "You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, my voice steady. "Because everything you built was standing on my ground." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and his breath quickening through the line. "You think this fixes anything?" he said finally, the edge of mockery creeping back in. "You've just made yourself look paranoid. You're sabotaging your own company." "My company," I said, "stopped existing the day you sold it for profit. The structure that's left, that's yours. You can keep it." He exhaled hard. "You're unbelievable. You've destroyed everything." "No," I said softly. "I just stopped holding it up." The line went dead. I sat there for a while, the phone still warm in my hand. Outside, the city carried on. The same traffic, the same distant sirens, the same indifferent pulse. Somewhere out there, my son was pacing in an office he no longer owned, yelling at a bank manager who couldn't help him. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt something closer to pity. When I was younger, I used to take my son to construction sites. I'd show him how steel beams flex without breaking, how rebar keeps the core steady. I told him that strength isn't about force, it's about endurance. He must have forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way. Maybe I did too. The following day, I met Alan for lunch at a small cafe by the river. The rain had turned into mist again, blurring the skyline into a soft watercolor of grays and silvers. Alan had that same quiet satisfaction engineers get when a calculation checks out exactly right. "He's scrambling," he said, stirring his coffee. "Tried to access the accounts this morning. 2 banks flagged him for authentication fraud. One even called me for confirmation. I gave them your statement." I nodded. "Good. There's more," he said, sliding a folder across the table. His consulting firm, Metro Growth Advisors, has been suspended pending review. Apparently, one of his investors noticed discrepancies in the capital reports. I opened the folder. The documents were dense, but the highlights were enough. Missing invoices, duplicate transfers, altered client agreements. It was all there, the house of cards he'd built out of arrogance and shortcuts. "He's coming apart," Alan said, quietly but completely. "Let him," I said. "Sometimes a man has to watch the cracks spread before he learns what concrete's really for." Alan leaned back, studying me. "You know," he said after a moment, "most people in your position would want to humiliate him, drag him into court, make a statement. I'm not most people," I said, "and humiliation doesn't build anything." He smiled faintly. "You really are an engineer through and through." That night I sat in the living room, the rain tapping softly against the window. I turned on the old radio, the one my wife used to keep on the kitchen counter, and let the static settle into the quiet. Somewhere in that noise I could almost hear her voice again. "You did what you had to, Patrick," she might have said. "But don't let justice turn into bitterness. You can rebuild a house from the ashes, but you can't rebuild peace if you burn it with resentment." I closed my eyes and listened until the rain drowned everything else. When I opened them again, the phone was blinking with another missed call. Then another, then a text, then several. "Dad, please call me. I need to explain. You don't understand what's happening." I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote, Phase 4. Silence holds more weight than noise. Then I added a line beneath it. He will call again when the structure fully fails. That's when truth becomes visible. 2 weeks passed. Each morning brought another small update from Alan. Another asset reclaimed, another shell company dissolved. Each night I watched the skyline from my back porch, the reflection of the towers rippling in the river like memory itself. The news eventually caught up. A headline one morning read, "Local development firm faces investigation over financial misconduct." No names were mentioned, but I recognized the numbers in the report. I knew exactly whose empire was sinking. I folded the newspaper neatly and set it aside. Revenge, I realized, wasn't fire, it was water. It seeped into the cracks, wore away the stone, and reshaped the landscape slowly, patiently, until nothing fragile could stand. And beneath it all, the foundation I'd built, solid, clean, unshakable, remained untouched. Late one evening, as I was locking up the house, the phone rang again. I almost didn't answer, but something in the sound, softer, slower, made me pause. "Dad," he said, voice smaller this time. Not angry, not commanding, just tired. "I don't know what to do." For a long time I said nothing. The silence stretched between us like an unfinished bridge. Finally I said, "Then you start where I did. You pick up the pieces, you build something honest, and this time, you build it on your own." He didn't respond right away. Then quietly, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I believed him. Maybe for the first time in years I heard the boy I'd raised, not the man who tried to replace me. "Good night, son," I said and hung up. The rain had stopped. The sky was clear. And for the first time since that day on the construction site, I slept without dreaming of collapse. The sky over Chicago was the color of cold iron the morning I walked into the boardroom. The same boardroom I'd designed 30 years ago. Glass walls, walnut table, steel beams exposed on purpose. I'd wanted it to look like a building still under construction because I believed that a company should always feel unfinished, always reaching higher. Today, it felt finished. My son was already there. He stood by the window, hands gripping the back of a chair, eyes fixed on the skyline as if he could still command it to bend his way. He turned when he heard the door close behind me. His suit was immaculate, but his face, drawn, sleepless, told a different story. "Dad," he said. Not sharp this time, not cold, just tired. "You didn't return my calls." "I didn't have anything new to say," I replied. He gestured toward the papers on the table. "I suppose these speak for you then." His voice wavered between anger and something smaller, almost fear. The papers were thick. The trust transfer documents, the asset lists, the letters from the banks confirming that control had changed hands. I had brought them all, not as proof of power, but as evidence of consequence. "I came to finish what we started," I said quietly. He exhaled, pacing around the room. "You've embarrassed me. Do you understand that? Do you have any idea how this looks? My partners think I'm under investigation, my staff doesn't know if they're getting paid, and the investors finally saw who you really are," I interrupted. "So yes, I understand exactly how it looks." He stopped pacing. "You think this is justice? Freezing accounts, locking me out, destroying years of work?" I took a slow breath. "You didn't build years of work. You built months of illusion. And it took less than a week for the wind to tear it down." His eyes flashed. That same spark I'd seen when he was 16 and thought he could outsmart gravity. "You're wrong. I did what had to be done to keep up, to grow. You were too cautious, too slow. The world doesn't wait for men like you anymore." I stepped closer to the table, placing both hands on the edge. "Then tell me, son, what did all that speed buy you? What do you have now?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched. I opened the folder in front of me, sliding one document toward him. "That's the new ownership charter for Sterling Construction. It belongs to the Eleanor Sterling Memorial Trust. Every property, every remaining contract, every piece of machinery, all protected, all legally out of your reach." He didn't touch it, just stared at it like a man staring at the ruins of a monument he built to himself. "I don't want your money," he said finally, the words small, almost brittle. "I just want to fix this." I shook my head. "You can't fix a crack by painting over it. You have to tear it down and start again, and you can't start while you're still pretending there's nothing broken." He ran a hand through his hair, laughing once. A dry, humorless sound. "So what now? You get to play the hero? The noble architect cleaning up the mess while your son walks away a failure?" "No," I said quietly. "You walk away free." He frowned. "Free? Free of the lies, the greed, the illusion that everything worth having can be taken. You've already lost the company, but you can still save yourself if you stop trying to rebuild what was never meant to stand." He looked at me for a long moment, the anger fading into confusion, then something softer. "Shame, maybe. You could have ruined me completely," he said. "You didn't." I met his eyes. "You're my son. I built you to last, but you have to decide what kind of man you want to be now." He looked down at the papers again. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered them, then stopped halfway, letting them fall back onto the table. "I don't even know where to start," he whispered. I took a step back and nodded toward the window. "Look outside." He turned. The skyline stretched before us. Towers we had both helped design, some old, some new. A city of mistakes and triumphs layered one over the other. "That's where you start," I said, "with what's still standing." He didn't move for a long time. The hum of the city filled the silence between us. Traffic, sirens, the faint whistle of wind against the glass. Finally he said, "You're really naming the trust after Mom?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, eyes distant. "She'd like that." For the first time in years, his voice carried something I hadn't heard since he was a boy. Sincerity. We stood there for a while, neither speaking. Then he said quietly, "What happens to me now?" You rebuild, I said simply. You start small. You learn to listen before you speak. You learn that not every wall is meant to hold weight. Some are meant to let light in. He smiled faintly at that. Not much, but enough. When I turned to leave, he didn't stop me. The sound of my footsteps echoed softly down the hallway, steady and even. Outside, the wind had picked up, but the air felt cleaner somehow. Lighter. I looked back once through the glass wall. He was still standing there, staring at the skyline, the papers untouched in front of him. For the first time, I didn't see him as an enemy. I saw him as a man standing in the debris of his own ambition, finally hearing the silence that comes after collapse. And in that silence, I hoped he'd find the first brick of something honest. That evening back home, I unlocked the safe and placed the final trust documents beside my wife's wedding ring. For years, I'd believed I was protecting a company. But what I'd really been protecting was her memory. The promise we made when we were young. To build things that last. I closed the safe and turned the key. The sound was small, certain, final. Justice doesn't roar, it settles. Like dust after demolition, drifting down to reveal what's still standing. And what was left, I realized, was enough. The morning after the meeting, Chicago woke under a sky that couldn't decide between sunlight and rain. The air was heavy with the kind of stillness that comes after a storm. Not silence exactly, but that quiet hum cities make when something has changed beneath the noise. I didn't go to the office that day. There was nothing left there for me. The war was over and the battlefield didn't need another victor walking its ruins. Instead, I drove to the Harrison Bridge, the first project I ever designed, and the one that still bore my name on a small brass plaque no one ever stopped to read. The wind off the river was sharp. I pulled my coat tighter and walked along the pedestrian path, my boots echoing against the steel grating. The water below was gray and restless. I stopped halfway across where the support beam split like ribs beneath me and leaned on the railing. That's when I took it out. The old photograph I'd kept in my wallet for years. It was creased, worn at the edges. In it, I stood beside my wife, both of us young and unwrinkled by time. Behind us, the bridge stretched out like a promise. Between us stood our son, maybe 8 or 9, wearing one of my hard hats that was far too big for him. He'd been smiling so wide the brim shadowed his eyes. We'd just finished cutting the ribbon that day. I remembered the weight of the scissors, the applause, the feeling that I'd built something that would last forever. But forever has its limits. I ran my thumb over the photograph, tracing the outlines of our faces. You'd be proud of him, I wanted to say to her. He's finally breaking in the right way. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? Breaking. Not destruction, but transformation. The way concrete fractures before it sets. The way hearts crack open just enough to let the truth in. I thought about my son. The way he'd looked yesterday, his pride stripped down to bone, that flicker in his eyes when I mentioned her name. It wasn't guilt or even regret, it was recognition. He'd finally seen her again, not through memory or obligation, but through the weight of what he'd lost. I leaned on the railing and closed my eyes. The wind was colder now, pushing against me as if testing whether I'd stand my ground. I did. After a while, I walked back toward the car. On the other side of the bridge, near the construction site of a new high-rise, a young engineer was shouting directions to his crew. His hard hat gleamed white under the gray sky. For a moment, I watched him. The gestures, the steady hand signals, the authority softened by care. He reminded me of myself decades ago, before titles, before legacy, before the weight of things too big to hold. As I passed, he looked up and nodded respectfully, the way builders do when they recognize one of their own. I nodded back and kept walking. Back home, I placed the photograph on my drafting table. The same table I'd used since the beginning, wood worn smooth by years of blueprints and coffee rings and small victories. I stood there for a long time, studying that captured moment. My wife's laughter frozen in sunlight, my son's smile untouched by ambition, my younger self believing that buildings could hold a family together. I took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to sketch. Not a tower this time, not even a house. Just a simple line drawing, 3 figures standing on a bridge, the water below, the sky above. I drew it slowly, deliberately, as if each line were a way of holding them in place a little longer. When I was done, I signed it in the corner, P. Sterling, 2025. Then I placed the photograph beside it, the real and the remembered side by side. That's when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but something in my chest told me who it was before I even opened the door. My son stood on the porch. No suit this time, no tie. Just a jacket and tired eyes. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from finally understanding the cost of everything. "I know it's late," he said. "Can I come in?" I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. He walked in quietly, looking around the house as if seeing it for the first time. His gaze lingered on the photos, the wedding portrait, the framed blueprints, the old newspaper articles about the firm. Finally, his eyes landed on the photograph on the drafting table. "I remember that day," he said softly. "You made me promise I'd never forget where we started." "And did you?" I asked. He looked down. For a while. He walked closer to the table, picking up the photograph carefully as though afraid it might break. "I don't know how to make this right," he said, "but I want to try." I studied him for a moment. The boy I raised was still in there, buried under the debris of who he'd tried to become. "Trying," I said quietly, "is a start." He looked at the drawing beside the photograph. "You drew this?" "Just finished it," I said. "It's not perfect, but it's honest." He nodded slowly. "You always said honesty was the first beam laid in any structure." "I did," I said, "and I meant it." For a moment, we just stood there in the stillness of the house. The clock ticked softly in the hallway, marking time not as loss, but as permission. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally. "Good," I replied, "because forgiveness isn't something you ask for. It's something you build." He nodded once, understanding more in that silence than words could ever give him. I turned back to the table and picked up the framed photo. "Take it," I said. He looked surprised. "Are you sure?" I smiled faintly. "I've been looking at it long enough. Maybe it's time it reminds you where the foundation began." He took it gently, his fingers trembling just a little. "Thank you, Dad." When he left, I stood by the window and watched him walk down the street. The sky had cleared completely, the city lights reflected in puddles along the curb. He paused once under the street lamp, looked back at the house, and then kept walking. In that moment, I didn't feel loss. I felt release. I went back to my drafting table, picked up my pencil, and drew one final line across the page. The horizon. The place where the bridge met the sky. Every builder knows that one day his structures will age, crumble, or be replaced, but if he's lucky, something he made, a bridge, a lesson, a sun, will stand long enough to remind the world that he was here. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Winter came late to Chicago that year. The river hadn't frozen yet, but the cold had started to settle in. That deep, metallic chill that seeps through the bones of the city and stays there. From my office window, I could see the tower site again. Only this time it wasn't hollow. The cranes were moving. The steel had gone up another 6 stories since autumn. A banner hung across the scaffolding in bold white letters. The Eleanor Sterling Foundation Project. It looked strange at first, her name, our name, spelled out against the skyline. But as the weeks passed, it started to feel right. She'd always believed that building should mean something, that concrete wasn't just structure, it was story. This new project wasn't meant to reach higher than the others. It wasn't about scale. It was about purpose. A housing complex built for single parents, widows, and those rebuilding from loss. People who needed walls not to display their success, but to shelter their hope. The first time I walked through the half-finished corridors, the echo of my footsteps sounded different than it used to. Not lonely. Alive. Every strike of the hammer, every vibration in the floor felt like breath returning to something that had been holding it too long. I spent most mornings there now, watching, listening, guiding. The new foreman, a young woman named Celia, ran the site with a steadiness I admired. She didn't talk much, but when she did, people listened. She reminded me of my wife. Strong without spectacle, firm without pride. "You know," she said one morning as we stood overlooking the courtyard frame, "most founders don't come back to the sites themselves. They leave it to the reports." "I've read enough reports," I said, smiling faintly. "I prefer the sound of hammers. Reports don't tell you if the concrete's too wet or if the wind's wrong." She grinned. "Guess not." We walked in silence for a moment, watching the workers pour new slabs. "This place," she said after a while, "it feels different, like it's being built for people, not profit." "That's the idea," I said. "Buildings outlive us. They might as well hold something worth remembering." Later that afternoon, I met Alan and Ben in the small conference room on the top floor of the construction office. The air smelled of dust and blueprint paper, the old perfume of creation. Alan had his usual stack of files in front of him. Ben had a small brass key lying on the table. "Everything's finalized," Alan said. "The trust owns the project outright. No debts, no shareholders, no loopholes. Once the last inspection passes, the first residents can move in by spring." Ben slid the key toward me. "This," he said, "is the master key to the building. Every copy will come from this one. I thought it was only right that it start with you." I turned the key over in my hand. It was heavy, perfectly cut, cool against my palm. "You two have done more than I asked." Alan shook his head. "We just followed your blueprint." I nodded slowly. "It's strange, isn't it? You spend your life building towers to be remembered. But in the end, the only thing that matters is what they shelter." Ben smiled faintly. "That's what makes this one different." Before they left, Alan placed one more folder in front of me. "Your son," he said quietly. "He called me last week, asked about donating to the trust." I paused, letting the words settle. "Did you tell him yes?" "I told him to talk to you," Alan said. "Some things still need to be built by hand." That night I walked the construction site alone. The sky was clear, the moon hanging low over the river, lighting up the steel skeleton of the new building. Each beam caught the light and threw it back, a geometry of silver lines cutting through the dark. At the center of the courtyard, I could already picture it. The memorial garden, small and quiet, with a stone bench facing east. The plaque would read, "In memory of Eleanor Sterling. She believed in foundations that last." I imagined her sitting there, smiling, that small, knowing smile she used to wear when something was right in the world. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the photograph again. The same one from the bridge. Only now the edges were smoothed, as if time itself had decided to stop trying to wear it down. I whispered to the air, "We're still building, love, just slower now." The wind lifted off the river and swept through the girders, making the structure hum like a tuning fork. It sounded alive, the heartbeat of steel and intention. A week later, my son came to see me at the site. He didn't call ahead this time, he just showed up standing by the entrance in a hard hat and an uncertain smile. "I wanted to see it," he said, looking up at the tower. "I've been reading about it everywhere, Mom's name. It's good to see it out there." "She earned it," I said. He nodded. "You did too." For a while we just stood there watching the cranes move against the sky. He looked older, softer somehow, less armor, more truth. "I want to help," he said finally. "Not with the money, with the work." I studied him carefully. His tone was steady, humble, not rehearsed. "You sure about that?" "I am," he said. "I'm not the same man I was. I don't know if I'll ever make up for it, but maybe I can build something that matters." I looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. "Then you can start here. There's always room for another set of hands that's ready to work." He smiled, small, almost shy, and extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm but not forceful, not a challenge, just acknowledgement. As we stood there, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet concrete and cold steel. The sound of hammers echoed through the air, rhythmic, steady, like a pulse shared between us. Maybe this was what rebuilding really meant. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but continuation. 2 generations side by side again, this time building not for profit, but for permanence. That evening I returned to my drafting table. The drawing from the bridge still sat there beside the photograph. I added a single new line, a 4th figure standing at the edge of the bridge. Taller now, older, different. Then I set the pencil down and whispered, "The foundation's strong again." Outside, the city lights shimmered across the river. For the first time in years, they didn't look like monuments. They looked like home. It's strange, the quiet that comes after rebuilding begins. It isn't the silence of absence. It's the kind that hums, alive beneath the surface, like the sound of air moving through new vents or the creak of a floorboard that's finally settled into its place. I started hearing that silence around the house, the kind that carries a peace too fragile to touch. A month had passed since the day my son came to the site. Since then, he'd kept his word. No speeches, no promises, no sudden gestures. Just work. He showed up before sunrise every morning, hard hat under his arm, and left long after dark. I watched him sometimes from the mezzanine walkway. He didn't notice me. He'd be standing with the concrete crew, reviewing plans, asking questions instead of giving orders. I saw him apologize when a measurement came out wrong. Not because he was caught, but because he finally understood that mistakes carry weight. The others on site didn't know who he was at first. They thought he was just another project manager, green but eager. And maybe that was the best thing that could have happened to him. To earn back his worth not through inheritance, but through humility. Celia told me once, "He's got your patience, you know. It just took him longer to find it." I smiled. It took me a while too. We didn't talk much outside the site. Maybe we both knew that words had done enough damage already. Instead, we built in silence, side by side, letting the work say what we couldn't. But some nights when I'd come home to an empty house, I'd catch myself listening for the sound of footsteps that never came. The rhythm of a younger man moving through the halls, asking about a blueprint or a calculation. I didn't miss the arguments, but I missed the noise of family. The sound of belonging, even when it came wrapped in conflict. One evening near the end of the year, I found an envelope on my porch. My name was written on it in handwriting I knew too well. Inside was a photograph, a new one. It was the tower, finished. The Eleanor Sterling Foundation project bathed in sunset light, cranes gone, windows gleaming gold. And at the bottom in neat letters, my son had written, "We did it, together." No signature, no plea, just that single sentence. I set the photo on my desk beside the old one. The bridge, the 3 of us. The two pictures faced each other like bookends, holding the space between what was lost and what had been found again. A few days later, I got a call from Alan. "The opening ceremony's next week," he said. "City officials, press, all of that. They want you to speak." I hesitated. "I don't think I have anything left to say." "That's exactly why you should speak," Alan said. "When a builder stops talking, that's when people start listening." He was right. So the next week I stood in front of the new building. A small crowd gathered under the morning sun. My son stood off to the side, not on stage but close enough to hear. Celia and her crew lined the edge of the courtyard. The mayor gave his remarks, then Alan said a few words about legacy and renewal. Finally, they handed me the microphone. I looked at the faces before me, young, old, workers, families, strangers. Behind them rose the building that had been born from everything we'd broken, rebuilt, and finally understood. "When I was younger," I began, "I believed that what we build defines who we are. Towers, bridges, offices. I thought they were the proof of a life well lived. But I learned something along the way." I paused, the wind tugging gently at my coat. "It's not the height of what we build that matters. It's the strength of what holds it up. The foundations we pour, not in concrete, but in character, in forgiveness, in love that survives even the collapse." I turned slightly toward the building. "This structure stands not because of wealth or pride, but because of those who stayed to rebuild when it would have been easier to walk away." I let my gaze drift briefly to where my son stood. He met my eyes, nodded once. Small, certain, real. "This building," I continued, "is proof that what's broken can be made whole again if you build with honesty." When the applause came, it felt soft, human, earned. Afterward, people mingled, cameras flashed, congratulations passed from hand to hand. My son waited until the crowd thinned, then walked up to me. "Nice speech," he said quietly. "I didn't write it down," I said. "Didn't need to," he smiled. "Mom would have liked it. She would have liked that you're here." He looked around, watching the sunlight dance on the windows. "You think she'd forgive me?" I took a long breath. "She already has. You just needed to forgive yourself." He nodded slowly. The silence between us felt different now. Not distance, but peace. The kind that doesn't need words to hold. That evening back at home, I poured 2 cups of tea. Old habit. I set one by the window for my wife, the way I used to when she worked late in the garden. Outside, the wind had softened, carrying the scent of new concrete and river mist. The house creaked as it settled. My son's photograph on the table caught the fading light. The old one, the bridge, hung just above it. I looked at them both and realized something. Silence isn't emptiness. It's the sound of everything that's finally in place. I took a sip of tea and let the quiet fill the room. The tower was finished. It stood against the winter sky like a prayer in steel and glass. Simple, strong, and silent. The Eleanor Sterling Foundation building wasn't the tallest on the Chicago skyline, but it didn't need to be. It didn't reach upward to be admired, it stood steady to be useful. On the morning of the dedication, I arrived early before anyone else. The sun hadn't quite lifted over the lake yet, and the air carried that sharp, frozen quiet that only Chicago knows. I took the elevator, all the way to the top floor. The observation terrace I'd insisted be left open to the public. When the doors slid open, I stepped into light. From up there, the city unfolded in all directions. Bridges, rooftops, smoke trails curling from chimneys. The river below cut through the streets like a vein of silver. For a moment, I just stood still and listened. The hum of the city was far below me, softened into something that almost sounded like breathing. This was my favorite sound. Not noise, but life. I walked slowly toward the edge, resting my hands on the railing. The wind was cold, but it didn't bite anymore. It felt honest, alive, reminding me that I was still here. Below, people were already gathering in the courtyard for the official opening. Families, workers, a few familiar faces from the city council. From this height, they looked like moving dots of warmth against the snow-dusted ground. For a long time, I thought that if I ever reached peace, it would come as a grand moment. A ceremony, applause, a speech to mark the end. But standing there, I understood it was quieter than that. Peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It seeps in slowly like light through morning fog. I took the small photograph from my coat pocket, the bridge photo, folded soft at the corners. It had been with me on every sight since that first day. I set it gently against the railing, letting the wind lift one corner. My wife's smile caught the sunlight just right, as if she were still laughing somewhere just beyond the clouds. "I kept my promise," I whispered. "I built something that lasts." I closed my eyes, let the wind move around me, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice. That clear, practical tone she used when she was proud but pretending not to be. "You didn't just build it, Patrick. You fixed what was underneath." I smiled. "We did." The elevator dinged softly behind me. Footsteps followed, measured, careful. I didn't turn until I heard him speak. "Didn't think anyone could get up here this early," my son said. "I still know the codes," I replied without looking back. He came to stand beside me, silent at first, taking in the view. The city reflected in his eyes, older, wiser, softer. For the first time in years, we looked out at the same horizon and saw the same thing. "She would have loved this," he said. "She does," I said quietly. We stood there, shoulder to shoulder, the wind tugging gently at our coats. Below us, the city stirred. Streetcars rolling, gulls circling the river, people moving toward the day. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I wanted you to have this," he said, handing it to me. Inside was a sketch, his sketch, of the foundation building. Pencil lines, neat but human, the way mine used to be. At the bottom, in his handwriting, were 3 words: "For what's still standing." I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't speak. I just nodded, folded the paper, and slid it into my jacket pocket beside the photograph. He looked at me then, really looked, and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I turned toward him. Every builder knows you can't give up on a structure just because it cracked. You reinforce it, you teach it to bear the weight differently. He smiled, small, real. "Guess you finally built something stronger than concrete." Maybe we both did. He laughed quietly, the sound drifting off into the cold air. For the first time in years, it didn't sound strained or hollow. It sounded young. When he left, I stayed behind. I leaned on the railing again, watching as he disappeared into the street below, one figure among many. He blended into the rhythm of the city. No longer a man trying to outshine it, but a part of it again. That, I realized, was legacy. Not names on buildings or plaques on walls, but the quiet continuation of something good through those who remain. I stayed up there until the sun broke fully over the lake. The light poured across the rooftops, turning the whole skyline gold. For a moment it felt as if the city itself were exhaling, releasing the last of the old weight. I closed my eyes and let the warmth hit my face. The world below was loud again, alive again. I could hear laughter from the courtyard, the sound of new footsteps on new ground. I whispered to the wind, "It's done." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't an ending. Builders don't believe in endings. We believe in foundations, in what's left after the storms, in what can be built again. I turned and walked toward the elevator. the sound of my boots echoing softly in the steel and glass. Each step felt lighter than the last. When the doors closed behind me, I caught one last glimpse of the sky, a reflection in the glass, pale blue and endless. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt truly home. If Patrick's journey moved you, from betrayal to redemption, from collapse to rebuilding, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss another story like this one.